Jaden Smith was standing in a crowd of 100,000 people at Coachella 2026, rapping every single word of Never Say Never, with the kind of fire that does not get rehearsed, and Justin Bieber was on the main stage singing that same song back to the desert sky. And between those two moments, one elevated on steel and light, one buried deep in the crowd, something happened that no production budget could have planned and no publicist could have scripted. It was the kind of moment that arrives maybe once in a generation of live music, the kind that does not ask for your attention but simply takes it, and it took everything. Phones pivoted away from the stage. Strangers grabbed strangers by the arm. The crowd split its attention clean down the middle between the artist performing above and the artist performing beside them, and for that stretch of one song the Coachella Desert contained two stages, one built from steel and engineering, and one built entirely from 16 years of friendship, memory, and the refusal of two people to ever really let go of what they built together when they were young and fearless and convinced the world had no ceiling. To understand why this moment hit the way it did, why it spread across the internet before the song had even finished, why people who were not even there felt something shift in their chests when they watched the clips, you have to go back before Coachella, before the years of silence and struggle and reinvention, before the world had time to complicate what Justin Bieber and Jaden Smith meant to each other. You have to go back to 2010, when two teenagers stood together on a track called Never Say Never, and told an entire planet that ceilings were optional. That song was not a commercial product dressed up as emotion. It was two kids who genuinely believed every syllable they were delivering, who carried a shared energy that the recording studio could barely contain, and whose chemistry on that record felt less like collaboration and more like a conversation between people who already understood each other without needing to explain themselves. Jaden delivered his verse with a confidence that was almost unsettling for someone his age, sharp, deliberate, alive in a way that demanded the listener pay attention, and Bieber rapped the whole thing in a chorus that felt like a declaration of war against every doubt the world had ever dared to place on him. Together they created something that transcended the pop charts it climbed and became a cultural marker, an anthem for a generation of young people who needed to hear that the only person with the authority to define their limits was themselves. 16 years passed. The world reshaped itself around both of them in ways neither could have predicted standing in that studio with nothing but ambition and each other. Bieber disappeared into the kind of darkness that fame manufactures when it moves faster than a person can grow, battling his health, his mental state, the weight of an industry that had consumed him before he was old enough to understand what was being taken from him. There were years when the music stopped and the silence said everything. There were years when people who loved his work held their breath and hoped without knowing exactly what they were hoping for. And then, slowly, the way real recoveries always happen, not in a single dramatic gesture but in 1,000 quiet decisions made in private, he came back. Jaden carved his own unconventional path across those same years, pushing into music, fashion, philosophy, and a creative identity so singular that mainstream culture spent a long time not knowing what to do with him, before eventually accepting that the point was never to be understood on anyone else's terms. In September 2025, Jaden was appointed men's creative director for the iconic French luxury house Christian Louboutin, a move that announced in the clearest possible language that the kid who once rapped about refusing to quit had not quit on a single thing. His debut collection landed in January 2026, 3 months before Coachella, 3 months before he would stand in a desert crowd and remind the world that no matter how far both of them had traveled, some things between them had never moved an inch. When Bieber took the Coachella stage on April 11, 2026, the weight of everything he was carrying was written into the way he inhabited every second of that night. The setlist read less like a concert program and more like a timeline of a life lived loudly and then quietly and then loudly again. Baby, One Less Lonely Girl, Beauty and a Beat, Where Are You Now, Confident, and eventually, inevitably, Never Say Never, songs that had soundtracked a generation's adolescence, and now arrived wrapped in the bittersweet understanding of everything that had happened since they were first released into the world. Somewhere in that crowd, Jaden Smith was absorbing all of it. He had come to the festival wearing a t-shirt featuring a 2012 photograph of himself alongside Bieber, a deliberate and deeply intentional nod to their shared history. The kind of wardrobe decision that tells you exactly where a person's heart lives regardless of how sophisticated or global their career has since become. He could have worn anything. He wore a memory. He wore the evidence that some friendships do not depreciate with time but instead accumulate meaning the way rivers accumulate depth, quietly, continuously, without needing an audience to validate the process. Then the opening notes of Never Say Never began moving through the desert like something being summoned rather than simply played, and Jaden started rapping his verse, not quietly, not self-consciously, but with the full unguarded intensity of someone who had carried those words in his body for 16 years and was not about to let this moment pass without honoring everything they still meant. The crowd around him felt it immediately. Phones turned. People shouted. The energy that had been flowing in one direction toward the stage suddenly found a second source, and the whole emotional temperature of that section of the crowd changed in real time. Social media captured it from dozens of angles, and the clip spread the way only genuinely unscripted moments can spread, not because an algorithm decided they were important but because thousands of simultaneous witnesses felt the same thing at the same moment and could not hold it quietly. Some voices on the internet attempted to diminish what they were seeing, calling it attention-seeking, suggesting the spotlight belonged exclusively on the stage, insisting that Jaden was making someone else's night about himself. But this reading dissolves the moment you look at it honestly. Jaden Smith was not stealing Justin Bieber's moment. Jaden Smith was that moment's oldest living proof. He was standing in a California desert watching his closest friend headline one of the largest stages on earth after years of pain and distance and hard-fought return. And he was rapping every single word because every word still belonged to him, and this night still belonged to both of them in ways that no guest list or backstage arrangement could ever fully capture. The Coachella Desert is famous for mirages, for conjuring images that shimmer beautifully and then dissolve before you can reach them. What happened when Never Say Never played across that stage and through that crowd was the opposite of a mirage. It was the most real thing in the desert that night. A 16-year friendship showing up exactly as it always had, without rehearsal, without announcement, without needing anything from the moment except to be completely and honestly inside it. Bieber sang. Jaden rapped. The crowd lost its mind. And in the electric space between that stage and that crowd, where music stops being music and becomes something closer to memory, and memory becomes something almost sacred, two people who once told the world to never say never stood on either side of the same song and proved, without saying a single word about it, that they had always meant every syllable.